So I've been trying to upload this video for a while, so I'm sorry it's late. I've been having problems with my computer. But I am focusing on a trauma-informed approach for newcomer immigrant youth in the juvenile justice proceedings. So my webinar starts off with just explaining the diversity of immigrant families, how they are all set up in different ways, and how they're going to be focusing on a smaller subset of immigrant children. So the children they will be focusing on is refugee children, asylum-seeking children, and children who have been unaccompanied going across the border into the United States. It starts off by explaining brain chemistry changes and how brain chemistry can be affected by trauma when people cross over the border. They spoke about how when during the time of adolescence, the prefrontal cortex is actually underdeveloped, and how during this time, adolescents are more affected by their, or more influenced by their peers. They're more prone to risk taking. So you'll see that more in these adolescents during this time. And because, they're being affected by trauma, they will probably also have more developmental delays, where that's why you see them taking more risks and being more influenced by peer behavior, because if they grow into adults, they never develop that part of their brain fully, and their brain is more concerned with survival, so it's still going to be delayed. The brain isn't concerned about the future because it doesn't feel that there will be a future. It's focused on the now and focused on the trauma that's being that the person is experiencing during this time. So that's why you'll see it differently. Also, there's some common traumas that immigrant youth go through when they're just being immigrants in general, or when they're crossing over the border. So they give a case study that is able to kind of conceptualize all of these experiences of trauma that somebody would have pre-immigration, during detention and or separation, and also post-migration. And they used an example throughout the webinar to make it easier to understand. They explained that trauma that can be experienced as pre-migration can be re-triggered and compounded during migration, detention, or post-migration. That these things don't just go away, they stay with the child, and the child will continue to have trauma responses during this time. They're going to be re-triggered, and because they're not given the space to be able to just explain how they feel or process what they've gone through, it just gets worse. And symptoms of anxiety, depression, anger, everything, depression, they all just become worse. And they will do certain actions that are risky in order to mitigate, in order to make themselves feel better during this time. Also, because they're in a new country, there are also other triggers, such as resettlement, acculturation, and isolation. Coming into a new country and not really understanding cultural norms, not understanding how to fit in, and kind of feeling isolated is a big thing, especially because some of them come into the country and go to families that they probably don't know that well, but it's something, or they are going into families that is only a slightly better situation than they were from before. So if they were experiencing abuse in the home in their country of origin, they might still be experiencing some forms of abuse or neglect in this new home here in the United States. So for a lot of these children, they experience a lot more things, a lot more trauma that just makes everything a lot worse. And the enduring effects of trauma can lead them into adulthood, where they feel like they're constantly in survival mode, or, in our terms, experiencing hypervigilance and not really being able to focus, not really being able to think ahead, or, think of the consequences of their actions, because one, their brain chemistry was affected, and they're delayed, but also because they don't know if there will be a tomorrow. They're not convinced because they've been living on the edge for so long. Um, and going back to family, some families don't have the resources to be able to help these children. They might be struggling just keeping them fed, and they might not know anywhere to get the mental health services, and they might not even trust mental health services because of the fact that they don't trust systems, and there might be other immigrants in the household that they're trying to get papers for, or keep on the down low that they're even there, so that way government agencies don't come and find them. So there is a lot of mistrust with mental health services, and that's a reason why these immigrant families will not reach out. Also, just cultural norms also always play a role. So they also talked about some considerations of culture and trauma for different people involved in court processes should also be taken into account when trying to help these children. So you have to think about the culture. You have to think about how in certain cultures, like maybe being on time isn't really a thing. Like time is kind of a looser thing, but in court proceedings, that is a huge deal. So, and they might not understand that because they're still in their acculturation process. They might have just gotten to this country, so that's not something they understand, or they might have never been to court before. So it's another thing to have to consider, is that it's a new environment that they are going to need a lot of help and support in, and maybe be resistant to your help. Because they're talking about signs to look for, which is mistrust, substance use if children are running away from placements, aggression, missed appointments, etc. There's going to be resistance there because they don't know if they can trust you. Because they've been through so many experiences in their life, they're not going to look at you and see you as a person who is worthy of trust, who is worthy of that. So that's another thing to consider, is that you can't expect them to trust you if they've never trusted anyone before. And if they have, that trust was betrayed. And it also talked about how one of the things that we can do to help these families as clinicians, but also just this is like for anybody in the criminal justice system who is wanting to help immigrant youth, is to build resilience in their families and build that resilience through connection and culture, because a lot of the times these are not things that are not taken advantage of, but used, I think would be the best way to explain it. These things are utilized or seen as advantages, but they are, because family connection and culture might be able to help mitigate some of that isolation, can help with self-esteem. I've read articles before where they say these things too. It's very helpful for immigrant youth and just immigrants in general to have that sense of connection, because they lose that once they leave their families from their family of origin and maybe feel unsure about their future here in the country, because a lot of it is unsure. And that's something to consider when they're going to court proceedings, is that if we don't take a trauma approach to this, is that there are a lot of legal implications to their actions, and it's not intentional. A lot of these youth aren't doing it intentionally. They're doing it because they're just trying to cope. They might turn to drug use, or might join gangs as a way to help with the isolation, help with the feelings that they're experiencing, and just trying to cope, and not really understanding how to do that. They just look for things that might help, and that's the best way to put it, is that they're just trying their best, but because of all of these things that are happening some at once, they can end up making some decisions for themselves that might put them in situations where they're going to end up in the juvenile justice system, and it might affect their chances of being able to even get papers or even visas, or if they're asylum seekers, like asylum, like it's really difficult. So these are all things to consider when you're working with immigrant youth and juvenile justice system, but also reasons why a trauma informed approach would be good in juvenile justice system and proceedings, because it would also just help the process go by like easier instead of coming from like an antagonizing point of view and coming more from like a person-centered approach is ideal. But they even said it's difficult because the system is so backed up that if people did do this all the time, it would be difficult. But it is important, and just because something is difficult doesn't mean that we shouldn't do it.